here's the real question, conviviality. What happens if a Jewish Jesus-following woman in that community marries the uncircumcised Gentile man who has the Spirit? What are they supposed to do when they have their first boy at 8 days old? What are they supposed to do? Are they supposed to circumcise him or not? That's a different question than should you be circumcised to come in the first place. Now, I think Paul would say, go ahead and circumcise the boy. I think he would suggest that.
Which he seems to advocate for in the case of Timothy.
Right.
Because saying don't do that is overstating his view.
Right.
Because overstating his view is to say, are you really about just jettisoning this heritage? And I think he would say, no, I'm not.
I think he would have said, you can circumcise the child as long as you acknowledge that circumcising the child is not what is bringing him into the covenant.
Yeah.
It's adiaphora. You're doing it because it's an old, quote Kaplan, it's an old folk way. We still do that, but it's not salvific. It's not significant. So if you have to do it, do it. Yeah. Just know that it doesn't mean anything.
And I 100% agree with that.
All right. Well, welcome everybody this afternoon to this April Clow panel at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion here in Cincinnati, HUC's flagship campus. My name is Chris Beecher, and I'm a third-year Ph.D. student here in the Pine School of Graduate Studies. I am also the Director of Campus Ministries for the American Baptist Churches of Ohio. And before we begin, I just want to say a few things. First of all, I'd like to express gratitude to the Clow Library for hosting this panel, and in particular Abigail Bacon, who's the head of Public Services and Outreach, for working with me to help get this arranged. I want to thank the staff of the Clow Library and the IT team for getting all this set up for us, so we really appreciate that. Furthermore, I'd like to express thanks to the American Baptist Churches of Ohio and the Campus Ministry Board for sponsoring this panel and the speakers. And before introducing the topic and the speakers, I want to mention a few upcoming items. First of all, we have a Pine School Student Conference on May 13th. The name of this conference is Redacted, Reused, Recycled, Ancient Texts Across Time and Space. And so the students of the Pine School of Graduate Studies invite you to a student-led conference presenting some of the research conducted over the course of their tenure at the Pine School. This event will feature a number of student presentations, a catered luncheon, and a keynote address by University of Cincinnati's Dr. Matthew Krause. And of course, later this evening, we're beginning a conversation here today in Pauline studies and its relation to early Judaism and early Christianity. But we're going to continue this talk later this evening at 7 p.m. at Kenwood Baptist Church as part of Kenwood's discipleship dialogues. The conversation will focus on the Jewish Paul and his Christian mission, misconceptions, and future hopes. And all of our panelists will be there this evening as well. And so, whereas this afternoon's panel will focus more on the academic and historical elements in Pauline studies, the conversation this evening will probably be more focused on personal and pastoral concerns. And you, of course, are all welcome to join us for that. We'd love to have you there. The topic under discussion this afternoon is Restoring Israel, the Jewish Paul and his Gentile mission. And the aim of the panel, if best expressed, could potentially be to stimulate dialogue around the first century figure of Paul in his Jewish and Greco-Roman context. And so to consider how doing so challenges modern readers to rethink Paul and his mission and what this entails for Jewish and Christian scholarship going forward. And so before we begin, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Our first speaker will be Dr. Joshua Garroway. Rabbi Joshua Garroway is the Sol and Arlene Braunstein Professor of Judeo-Christian Studies at the Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion in Los Angeles. He was raised in Rochester, New York. Rabbi Garroway earned rabbinical ordination from HUC, JIR, in 2003 and a Ph.D. from Yale University in 2008. While his academic books and articles focus on the origins of Christianity, and specifically the life and writings of Paul, his teaching and popular writing deal with Jewish texts and history more broadly. Rabbi Garroway lives in Pasadena, California with his wife, Professor Christine Hendrickson Garroway, and their three tween-age boys. For fun, he enjoys chess, tennis, opera, period pieces, and taking his kids to Dodgers games and an occasional ping pong match with other scholars. Next to him, we have on my far left, we have Dr. Jason Staples, Ph.D., UNC-Chapel Hill. He's an assistant teaching professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at North Carolina State University. He's the author of Paul and the Resurrection of Israel, Jews, Former Gentiles, Israelites, and the Idea of Israel in Second Temple Judaism, a new theory of people, exile, and Israelite identity, which was published in 2021, and a variety of other articles and writings. Given the wages of an adjunct professor, Jason also needs to work other jobs to feed his family, so he has worked in sports media for over 15 years, does freelance editing, and works as a voiceover artist and audiobook narrator. And then to my immediate left is Dr. David Palmer. Dr. David Palmer is an adjunct professor of New Testament at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary in Hamilton, Massachusetts. Additionally, David has served as the senior pastor for Kenwood Baptist Church in Cincinnati for well over a decade. He holds a Ph.D. in New Testament backgrounds from Hebrew Union College, and his doctoral dissertation focused on the role of Scripture in shaping a pious life and was entitled Judaic Paideia, the philosophical argument and use of Scripture in 4th Maccabees. He is involved with leading teams of pastors and seminary students with Training Leaders International to Athens, Greece, offering theological training to ethnic leaders. He and his wife, Dr. Christine Palmer, also a graduate of HUC-JIR, regularly lead archaeological study tours in Israel, Turkey, and Greece. As we begin this, Dr. Garroway will speak first, and then Dr. Staples, and then Dr. Palmer. And afterwards, we'll be taking some questions from the audience and from our Zoom viewers. Abigail will, sift through those questions and present them as we draw towards the end. But I want to give our panelists a hand. Welcome them today, please. And again, thank you all for attending, and I guess we'll go ahead and kick it off with you, Dr. Garroway.
Sure. So can people hear me? Do I bring the mic over? Well, this should be fine.
Yeah.
It's fine? People can hear me? Okay, so I'm going to start differently than I thought because of where I'm sitting.
Between the two beeves.
That too. I met my wife right here. This used to be a series of tables and the computer station. There was one computer was right there, and I was there, and she was studying at the tables here. And that was more than, 23 years ago or whatever. So it's kind of odd to be here. So I want to make one comment about her. She was not Jewish when she started as a student here. She's now a Jewish person. I'm not going to go into that story. I was recently, now several years ago, talking to a friend of mine from college. And in college, as many New York Jewish kids do, I found the other Jewish kids, and we kind of became a little clique. And we're still friends today. And a few years ago, one of them said to me, isn't it weird that you're like the one that takes Judaism seriously in our group? We're all kind of lax Jews, but we married Jews and you didn't. And I said, really? Because Christy was a Jewish person when we got married. And he said, oh yeah, you know what I mean. And I said, I took issue with it. We're still best friends. But nonetheless, some of you who are not Jewish, you might be like, no, I don't know what that means. But anybody who's Jewish knows exactly what that means. And what it means is, yeah, she's Jewish, but she's not Jewish because she's a convert. That's a 2,000-year-old problem. I can't go into great detail, but let me give you one other non-Pauline example that might put it in perspective. Around the year 40 BCE, very famous king, Christians know, King Herod, was fighting for the crown of Judea against the last of the Maccabean kings. And Josephus writes about this battle, and Josephus says that the last of the Hasmonean kings said to the people, you can't choose Herod to be your king, because in Greek it says he is a hemi-Judaios. Hemisphere means half. He's a half Jew. Now, when most people read that, they think what it means is what we mean when we say half Jew. He had one Jewish parent and one non-Jewish parent, when in fact, it's far more likely that what Josephus means is he's a half Jew because his father is a half Jew. Well, why was his father a half Jew? Because his father was a half Jew. Why was his grandfather a half Jew? Because he had been an Idumean, someone that lived south of Jerusalem, and had, for some reason in the time of King John Hyrcanus, converted to Judaism. And so in a Jewish mind, in Josephus's mind, in a Maccabean mind, he's a Jew, but not Jew. And there's no word for Jew. So he used hemiudaios. My friend used, well, you know what I mean. So what I've been fascinated with in Jewish history broadly is the language that we use to describe transition in and out of the Jewish community. And it's an incredibly complex phenomenon, and that's the background that I have used to try to understand what Paul is doing and to try to make sense of some of the very difficult, seemingly contradictory language in Paul. Because my belief is that Paul believes that in the wake of the resurrection of Christ, everything about Jewish identity has changed. It is no longer about descent from Abraham or Isaac or Jacob. It is no longer about observance of the Torah. It is no longer about circumcision or the performance of Jewish law. It is simply about baptism into the resurrection and the brand new identity that that gives you. And in my opinion, Paul thinks that that new identity is Jewish. It's Israel. It's child of Abraham. It's every one of all of the monikers that are used to describe Jewish people. But what do you do if you tell a Gentile who's just been baptized, yeah, now you're a Jew, now you're Israel, now you're a son of Abraham? And they say, really? Because there's a synagogue down the street, and they're Israel, and they're Jews, right? To be one of them, don't you have to do X, Y, and Z, or be X, Y, and Z? And I think what Paul is doing in his letters is saying, yeah, you're a Jew. Like, I know Jew means that. I know Israel means that, but you're actually Jew and you're actually Israel. And I have no other way of describing it except in the terms of that one. So sometimes it kind of sounds like I'm talking about that one, but I'm really talking about this one. And it produces contradiction where people, if you're a philologist and you say, well, I figured out that Israel means this here, so therefore Paul must mean the same thing everywhere else that word appears. But that's in fact not how language works. We all the time use words in different ways, and it creates ambiguity that then we have to clarify. What we don't have, I think, is Chloe or whoever was presenting Paul's letters saying, a hardness of, this is you guys know this, from 11:25 in Romans, right? A hardness has come upon a part of Israel, obviously by which I mean the Jews, in order that all Israel, obviously here I mean saved people, which is baptized people, which is really Israel. And Chloe was probably there explaining what that means, but it's not there in the simple text. And so, I don't want to go through all of the passages that I think make better sense this way, but I would just tell you that I think, for example, in Romans 2, Paul says what he really thinks a Jew is, even though he knows that Jew means the person at the synagogue. And in Romans 9 through 11, he tells you what he really thinks Israel is, but putting it in terms of what you probably think Israel is. And in Romans 4, he explains what a child of Abraham is, even though he knows what you really think a child of Abraham is. And in Philippians 3, he says what the circumcision or to be circumcised really means, even though he knows what you think circumcision means. And that is how I approach all of these controversial passages in Paul's letters. And before I finish, I just want to explain why I think that has relevance beyond just giving better readings of Pauline passages, which is nothing to sneeze at in its own right, but I like to think in sort of broader historical terms. So what I argued in my early work on Paul is that what we see in a modern kind of theory called post-colonial theory is that when, for example, a colonial country, let's say, I hope this doesn't offend anyone, England, right, goes into, let's say, India, right, what happens is that there are people who are kind of stuck, the colonialized subjects stuck between trying to be English and being English, but at the same time being stuck in being Indian, but not wanting to be Indian anymore. And by the way, it works in reverse too. Englishmen that go to India who become Indianized, but somehow remain English. And according to a lot of post-colonial theorists, to make a very long story short, what happens is that over time, it becomes untenable to try to negotiate two mutually distinct identities. And a very famous post-colonial scholar called Homi Bhabha describes this as what he calls the third space of enunciation, right? You're stuck. I'm not English, but I'm not Indian. What am I? And you have to then articulate what you are in terms of those other things. So what I tried to argue is that Paul's describing all of these new acolytes, saying, yeah, you're Jews, you're Israel. You're not Jews, you're not Israel. And that it makes sense that the people who heard this and processed this over time came to ask the question, what are we? Are we Israel or not Israel? Are we Jews or are we not Jews? And what emerged from that, and I don't think coincidentally emerged in the generation after Paul, is precisely the word Christian. A new thing that says, well, yeah, I know I'm Christian. I'm a different thing. It's Israel. It's like Israel. It's not the old Israel. It's a third new thing. And that's what began the centuries-long project of describing what it means to be this third thing Christian over and against Gentile, which we kind of once were but aren't anymore, and Jew, which we kind of are now but aren't really. We're something that's a third thing, as gets described, I think, for the first time by Tertullian at the end of the 2nd century, a third race, a third group, a third people, Christians. That's how I read Paul, how I read the terminology of Paul, and I shall now pass to Jason.
So that's going to be a tough one to follow, but I'm going to.
You didn't meet your wife here?
No, I did not. Actually, I do have to know who approached whom.
It's a long story. I was 23, I don't know, and there are people here who know, this isn't swearing, how much of a jackass I was at that age. I was young and very adolescent and stupid. And so I was still in the age where boys try to impress women by being mean and weird and angry and cruel, and it's hard to explain. And it kind of worked. Because she was like, I want to figure out what the hell's wrong with this guy. So then she made some cookies and left them for me. And I found out from Bill Limbacher, who I don't think is here anymore, but he will always be our matchmaker, because he's like, I saw Christy in the kitchen baking cookies, and then I saw you eating cookies. What's happening? I said, she made the cookies.
How about that?
Yeah.
So has she figured out what's wrong yet? Or?
I
My wife would say almost exactly the same thing.
survived rabbinical school, and it like Enkidu, it tempered me.
Oh my goodness. So that would make rabbinical school. Never mind. Okay, so tough act to follow, but I'm going to do my best to do so, and also I'll be a little on the shorter side, I think, to make sure that we can facilitate some discussion as well. But actually, I think among active biblical scholars today, I'm probably the closest to your view of anybody else.
At least those who are socially acceptable.
That's probably right, yeah.
Oh, there's a lot of far-right Christians that probably agree, but their scholarship doesn't get published.
Yeah. But in terms of active biblical scholars, I would say, as I was going through the research process, obviously I published after you did, I would say yours is probably the closest to where I came down. So what I want to do actually to start is to put a little bit of history on this from the sort of New Testament studies side of things, and that is, some of you already will know this, some of you may be less familiar. So I'm going to lay down a couple of things about sort of how Paul has been understood through a few different generations, and then I'll talk about how I kind of came to my distinctive view on this. So first of all, the sort of traditional perspective, what is often called the old perspective on Paul, is really a Protestant perspective. It's something that grew out of Luther's critique and criticism of the Roman Catholic Church in his day. And Luther, of course, didn't actually want to leave the Catholic Church. He wanted to reform it. He wanted the Roman Catholic Church to heed his correction and make doctrinal changes, and then and so on. But that didn't happen. As often happens with religious reformers, another group actually develops out of their attempts to do something with the tradition that they're actually inheriting. Something to this, right? But that old perspective basically boiled down to reading Paul and the Pauline epistles as though he was arguing against what Luther and others would call legalism. And this is the stereotypical, some of you are very familiar with this, essentially the stereotype of Jews as legalistic, trying to earn salvation by works and by doing the law, and everything is about trying to earn God's favor. And for Luther, what Jews basically are, the people that Paul is arguing against, specifically Paul's Jewish interlocutors, for Luther, he reads them as essentially proto-Catholics. They're people for whom, he's protesting this phenomenon called indulgences, right? Indulgences are where, if you sin, you do something that you're not supposed to do, something wrong before God, you pay a little bit of money to the church. This developed out of the notion of penance, which developed actually out of the Jewish notion of restitution, right? That saying you're sorry isn't enough. And I actually think that's a good concept, right? Saying you're sorry doesn't really finish things. You should make it right. And if you stole from somebody, you should give it back and actually maybe a little bit more on top, right? Well, what happens if you lusted after another man's wife? What happens if you commit a sin that isn't easily dealt with that way? Well, one thing you can do is, a little bit of payola for the church will stand in the way as the penance, the proper way of demonstrating your repentance. And then very quickly, this transitioned into indulgences, where at a certain point, you could actually buy indulgences in advance. This is now going to be on the internet that I'm planning on committing adultery, but hey, whatever. I'm planning on committing adultery. What's that going to cost me, right? And so then you buy in advance this indulgence so that you can live how you want, but then you pay. And then the best part is you could do this posthumously. I'm going to live like a total rotter right up until I die, and then after I die, I'm going to bequeath this amount of my wealth to the church, and that's going to get me out of the, post-mortem punishment in the world to come, as it were, right? So Luther thinks that this is an absolute abomination and violates the whole basis of the Christian gospel as he sees it, which he thinks should result in, people living better lives, not, basically being able to pay for living bad lives. And he then interprets Paul's arguments as arguing against that kind of notion. And then what that then does is sort of, as he reads that back into the text, Paul's opponents must be trying to use the Torah this way. The whole objective is, I'm going to offer sacrifices. I'm going to, keep the food laws and so on. And in so doing, that's going to be what's going to make me righteous before God. As opposed to these other things, which really righteousness comes from Jesus, justness comes from Jesus. So he sees that and reads it that way. And this became a very common Protestant reading for centuries. It's the reading that is still so widely presumed among Protestants and especially evangelicals, that any suggestion to the contrary, that Paul's not actually talking about that, is often received as tantamount to heresy, right? So the thing is, that's actually a really poor reading of Paul's letters. Paul's not arguing against Jewish legalism, which we don't actually see anything of the sort. And there's nothing like indulgences in early Judaism, right? Well, okay, I see your eyes go wide, but as a default. Mm-hmm. Right, there's painting with a broad brush here. But ultimately in the 70s, you had some people, Ed Sanders and some others, who came in and basically said, look, when we read the early Jewish sources closely, we do not see Luther's proto-Catholics who are running around worried about earning God's favor through doing works of the Torah and, essentially proto-indulgences, anything like that. We don't see this. Instead, we see something else. Paul's arguments against whatever was traditional before must be about something else, because they can't be about that. And Sanders was absolutely right about this. Now, it's taken a long time for that to sort of become the default. I mean, there's the old saying that scholarship moves forward one death at a time, and it's taken progress happens slowly, but it's now generally default within the field that the older perspective is normally not the default. And some way of grappling with what Sanders puts forward, which others have put forward. I mean, George Foot Moore had already basically said some of these things half a century before Sanders. Sanders just delivered it in a way that made it, unassailable for New Testament scholars. They had to grapple with it in a way they hadn't before. But that led then to a number of ideas of what is Paul arguing against? If his problem with Judaism is in legalism, then why does he do what he does? Like, why does he stop being a Jew in the way that he had been before? Which, of course, presumes that he had stopped being a Jew in the way that he had been before, but we'll address that in a moment. So one then thing that builds off of Sanders was the new perspective on Paul. Some of you have heard about this. And that basically proposed that what Paul's really concerned about is essentially the move that, to some degree, your friend made, which is like, you know what I mean. And that is that there is a privilege in Jewishness that essentially derives from the privileges of birth or inheritance of the Torah and so on. And essentially what Paul's arguing against is some version of what the New Perspective folks tend to call Jewish ethnocentrism, or pride of place in God's purpose. I think an easier way to put it would be racism. It basically, the idea is Paul's not worried about legalism, he's worried about Jewish racism. Jews are just basically proto-racists. Well, what you've done is you've traded a perspective that's perfectly at home in the theological debates of the 16th century for one that's much more at home in the late 20th century, right? And in each case, by the way, the Jews have the distinction of being the regressive foil for progressive Christianity that is moving the world forward. And, if only those Jews had listened, right? So this is a new perspective, although I think has obviously its own issues there. In the wake of that, there's been another movement that's developed really within the last 10 years, I would say. There's been sort of traction in that, and that's the Paul within Judaism movement, which has argued against this whole idea that Paul stands up opposed to Judaism in the first place. So you look at Sanders, his book is Paul and Palestinian Judaism, which presumes that it's Paul on one side and then Palestinian Judaism on the other, and that one is a foil for the other. And the Paul within Judaism perspective has generally argued that, well, we don't really have evidence. Like, Paul continues to refer to himself in the present tense as a Pharisee. He doesn't say, I was a Pharisee. Right? And that's true in Acts as well, by the way. Acts continues to portray Paul as a law-observant, at least in his own mind, Jew. He continues to, he shaves his head after he becomes impure, when he's under a vow. He fulfills his vow by going into the temple. That's actually when he gets arrested. There's a variety of these things that shows that he doesn't seem to have, left a lot of this stuff behind. And so then now you have a little bit of an effort to say, maybe Paul's not actually arguing against legalism or Jewish racism, in which we don't see these things represented in that way. Maybe that's not what he's arguing against at all. Maybe it's something else. And there's been a variety of different, things that are being tried on in that new 10-year, project that's underway, this new trajectory. One thing that I've found unpersuasive is a more recent suggestion, and you've had several others who've argued that essentially what makes Paul distinctive is he just recognizes that he has a mission to Gentiles. And it's all about incorporating Gentiles in the larger plan of God, but not really within the people of God as in like Jews or Israel. They're not Israelites, but they're sort of in that
end time hangers on.
Yeah, they're like the end time hangers on. They're righteous Gentiles. They're the righteous from the nations who are brought in as a part of, following Israel's Messiah and all of this. But as far as Israel goes, really not much has changed, except that like Jesus is their Messiah, but like whether they actually recognize that or not, it's not really necessarily germane to Paul's gospel or not. What really matters for Paul is that Gentiles submit to Israel's Messiah, and that's what he's really all about. And otherwise, he's just not arguing against anything, Jewish, as it were. And, I would say both of us sort of fall sort of in the Paul within Judaism tangentially, like sort of within that, sort of framework in a lot of ways, but different from that trajectory, because one of the things that I've found is that I find that unpersuasive, partly because when you read Paul's letters, he says he received 39 lashes minus one 5 different times, which means he's come under synagogue discipline 5 different times. That's not a beating that you're getting from, Roman authorities. He got that too, he says. You have to figure out what he's done exactly to so offend his fellow Jews and get them to think that he has so threatened the community. This is not like something you just, you're proposing some interesting teaching here of the Torah. I disagree with it, so, to the lashes with you. That's not the way this works. This is something that someone is seen as actively threatening the Jewish community in some way. I think you have to account for where he's getting there. So I don't think Paul is actually arguing against Judaism, at least in his own mind, but I do think that fellow Jews of his period are looking at him and going, what you are doing is a major threat to our people and to our community. So we have to grapple with both sides of that. Now, where I come in on this is sort of a longer journey, and I'm going to try to keep this part especially short. But basically, everything started for me on this was in a 2003 class on the prophets, and I was reading very closely. I was reading Jeremiah in particular for a term paper. And the thing that struck me, and there were a couple places in some of the secondary literature that stood out on this as well, where people were observing this. The thing that struck me was that Jeremiah promised the restoration and the reconciliation of the house of Israel and the house of Judah. And you see this language a lot in Jeremiah. You see it also in Ezekiel and other places. And I knew my Bible well enough to say, house of Israel is usually language for the northern kingdom of Israel, especially when it's paralleled with Judah. Well, that's strange because the house of Israel's been, done away with. They were done away with almost a century and a half before Jeremiah is making this prophecy. It's a very strange thing to say. Now, what's actually in the mind of the prophet at that point, I don't know. But then it occurred to me that this very prophecy is the longest passage that is quoted in the New Testament, verbatim. It's quoted in the Epistle to the Hebrews in full. Interestingly, as though Gentiles are incorporated in it. But the promise is not to Gentiles, right? It doesn't say, I will make a new covenant with Israel and some Gentiles. It doesn't say that. And Paul himself calls himself, when he says, how should you think of us? You should think of us as ministers or servants of a new covenant. And then he consistently alludes to Jeremiah's promise as what he thinks is happening in his ministry. So this got me started in 2003. And, the book that just got published this last year is sort of the completion of that big project to try to figure out and pull out, what's he doing? What are they doing here? And essentially what I ended up concluding is when I started going through early Jewish literature, so Jewish literature in the Second Temple period in particular, but also late biblical literature, I found that there was a surprising thing. When I read the word Israel, it didn't always mean the same thing as the Jews. That was surprising because you read like the Talmud, and generally speaking, they're in the Mishnah. They're generally speaking, they're talking about Israel, Israelites, with some exceptions. There's question about why does it call Mordecai a Jew? He's from Benjamin, and then there's this whole discussion, right? Which tells you, by the way, that is something they're aware of that late, right? This is something that continues within the tradition. But what I found is that those words are not used synonymously, and I found that there was a whole host of biblical scholarship trying to explain that fact, that they are not coextensive. You would expect two synonymous words to be used, kind of evenly distributed through the literature. But what you'll find is that, like in Josephus, he uses the words Jew and Israelite in different parts of his works. He uses the term Israelite, interestingly, in the period of his Antiquities that focuses on where the northern kingdom is, where you have the monarchy, and where the northern kingdom is active. And up until basically the Babylonian exile, he kind of uses that term. After the return from the Babylonian exile, that term never shows up in Josephus again, which is striking. And after that, all of a sudden the word Jew shows up throughout, and that only shows up 22 times prior to the exile. So he shifts terms. So I started pulling on that thread. What's going on here? Because Paul shifts as well in Romans. He says, he uses language and refers to his contemporaries as Jews frequently through his letters, but only uses the word Israel 6 times, except in the chapters Romans 9 to 11, where all of a sudden he talks about Israel and uses that term either 13 or 14 times, depending on a textual variant. So in 3 chapters, he uses the term Israel or Israelite twice as many times as he does in the rest of his letters combined. Something's going on there. So what I ended up doing is really doing a deep dive on what's going on in early Judaism, in how these concepts, not just the terms, but the concepts, the ideas that are in play are understood. And what I found is that there remained a consistent expectation of exactly what Jeremiah and a lot of the prophets are saying, that you're going to get a full restoration of Israel at some point in the future. And this remains a present hope for lots of theologically, I don't even know a good term for that, lots of theologically attuned traditional Jews. It remains a hope. I mean, the traditional Amidah blessing or prayers are full of that hope. It's in almost every one of them. It's in the traditional Passover Seder. There's a reason that the chair for Elijah is left open, right? So this hope is still there, but the interesting thing is throughout this literature, it's not just an expectation of the regathering together and the ascendancy and the blessing of Jews, but of all 12 tribes of Israel. That shows up over and over again, right? Blessed are you, Lord, who regathers the 12 tribes, right? This is a current thing. But then when we start going back, when was the last time anybody heard from somebody from Reuben, from the tribe of Reuben? Did I hear they're in France? Yeah, or Naphtali, or when do we hear from some of these folks? And you've got a fun anecdote on this as well that I've heard, going back to your own training, but this whole question of what's going to happen with those folks, and if the expectation is all 12 tribes of Israel will be restored, well, you see that in Jesus' ministry as well. He assigns 12 apostles and says, you 12 will sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Well, the thing is, in Jesus' day, there aren't 12 tribes of Israel. That's a pretty big promise then, isn't it? Now, the real question is when Jesus gets crucified and then, there's claims that he's resurrected, well, where is this restoration that's supposed to happen? Right? That's the real problem. This is the problem in the book of Acts. Will you now restore the kingdom to Israel? Is now the time, now that you've resurrected? And the whole book of Acts is sort of an apology to show why, yeah, that's happening, but it's happening in a way that's not expected. So, my argument then is that Paul reads these things in a very specific way. He reads Hosea, he reads these prophets. Hosea says to the northern kingdom, you are not my people. That doesn't apply to Jews. He doesn't say that to Judah, but he does say it to the northern tribes. And he says, what's that? Okay, so I'll wrap up. Sorry, it's easy. Basically, my argument is that what Paul does is he says all of Israel has to be restored, but a portion of Israel assimilated among the nations. So now Israel has to be resurrected from the nations. At least part of Israel has to be resurrected from the nations. And you have to have Jews and Gentiles together in order to have all Israel present. And so in that sense, they're Israelites, the ones who are coming in, but they're not necessarily Jews. But they are Israelites, sort of, right? And they're resurrected Israelites, sort of. And so that's where we're really close, but there's a little bit of a difference on that. So that's where I find myself. So I will yield back the floor.